Welcome to this short webinar that covers the findings from a thematic audit recently carried out by the Central Quality Assurance team. The purpose of the audit was to explore police involvement and adultification across the Polaris community. The diagram on screen outlines some of the main reasons we decided to carry out this audit. First of all, as a safeguarding team, we look at data in the background from across the community, and police involvement has remained the most common reason for us to notify Ofsted for quite a while now. In addition, the published case review into Child Q last year contributed to the need for this thematic audit. For those of you who don't know, this was an external review and was about a young black girl who was strip searched by the police while she was at school on her period. And it raised a lot of concerns and questions around adultification bias and the treatment of children and young people by police, as well as issues around appropriate adults. Over the last few years, there's been emerging research on adultification. As a reminder, a very basic definition of adultification is that it's a form of racial prejudice where children of minority groups, typically black children, are treated by adults as being more mature than they actually are. This can have serious implications and means that a child may not be seen as such, which can have consequences in the way they're safeguarded, and they might not be safeguarded in the same way other children would be. Finally, we know the statistics around children in care show that there's more involvement with the police. Combined, all of these factors influenced our decision to carry out this thematic audit. The aims of the audit were to seek assurance that police are used as a last resort and that appropriate steps have been taken prior to their involvement, to explore incidents where police have been involved with our children and young people, to assess their approach, and if concerns were noted, how our agencies and services intervened, to assess the community confidence in raising and challenging incidents of poor or harmful practice, to investigate the understanding of adultification across the Polaris community and ascertain through audit activity whether there was evidence of it taking place. And finally, to explore the views of professionals across the community in relation to police as safeguarding partners. So there were two parts to this audit. First of all, a survey was circulated to staff members across the community, and that was completed by 129 people. And we just wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you to anyone who completed the survey. We had a really good response rate from people across all services, and it's been really helpful when considering our findings. We'll continue to include surveys as part of our thematic audits moving forwards. Secondly, the QA team audited 128 incidents that had taken place between January and June 2022, where the police had been involved with our children. This number does, however, exclude any police involvement where there was a missing incident or incidents where the child was a victim. Moving on to the findings, the first we looked at was the involvement of police in the first place. In the majority of cases, it was found that their involvement was justified, and actually a lot of incidents happened out in the community or had been reported by members of the public. In cases where the call had came from someone within the community, whether it be foster parents, residential staff, teachers, it was often recognised that the child was in crisis and attempts were made to de-escalate the situation prior to the police being called. However, on some occasions, recordings weren't always that clear, which made it difficult to understand why the police became involved and why they were needed. This highlights the need to make sure that records are suitably detailed. We often saw words such as aggressive and threatening, but without any further detail of what that behaviour actually involved. Then finally, and I know it's easy to say when auditors are removed from the situations, but there were occasions where the actions of adults appeared to escalate the child's behaviour more. When a child does become distressed, it's important that you remember any training you've completed and that you try and stay as calm as possible. We then looked at the police response to incidents, and it's important to emphasise here that in the majority of cases, their response was appropriate and proportionate. There were several cases viewed where the police took safeguarding measures rather than pursuing a criminal justice route. This was particularly seen in cases where children were being exploited. It's important here to remember that police are our safeguarding partners. It was also quite common to see children being invited back for voluntary interviews to take place after the situation had calmed, which is also good practice. Unfortunately, there were a few cases where it appeared the police response wasn't always appropriate. One problem we did see in several cases is the significant time delays taking place, which caused children to become increasingly anxious. This included things such as the police telling children they were going to come out and speak to them, and either not doing so or visiting weeks or months later, and also then pursuing alleged minor offences that took place quite a while ago. As we just touched on, unfortunately, there were some times where the police response does not appear to have been appropriate. It was actually found that on 19 occasions, children were kept in cells overnight. The majority of these incidents appear to be unnecessary, and some children were kept overnight despite the alleged incident taking place weeks, or in some cases months ago, which therefore makes us question whether the overnight detention was required. There were also a few cases where children were kept overnight so they could be interviewed the next morning. However, on a few occasions, there wasn't anyone to interview them the following morning, so they were released anyway. All of our children should be living in a setting with trusted adults, and therefore it might have been beneficial for the adult to challenge this situation and the requirement for them to stay overnight by saying they'll ensure the child returns in the morning for an interview to take place. I've added some key legislation and guidance on this slide in that text box that you should consider when the police do become involved with any of our children, especially if they're planning on keeping them overnight. As the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child says, it really should only be used as a last resort, keeping a child overnight. When challenging the decisions of the police, these key documents and legislation can be really useful in giving you some evidence towards your argument. When it came to challenging police, there was very little evidence of this taking place. However, on one occasion, a staff member's knowledge around appropriate adults allowed them to challenge the police to ensure that there was one present for the young person. This highlights the importance of having the knowledge around these subjects. In another audit, it was found that there was really good evidence of the agency reflecting on the experience of the young person with the police and raising concerns with the local authority. As a result, the local youth offending team were contacted with questions about the police's treatment of the child, and the agency received a lengthy response explaining why the police took the action they did. The survey found that the majority of people either felt extremely confident or somewhat confident when challenging the police. This is a positive finding, and we just need to ensure that we are doing this where required and that it is clearly recorded on our systems. When it comes to incidents, overall, there was good evidence of management oversight, and any police involvement with our children and young people is something we suggest you do consider reflecting on, ideally also with the child if appropriate. The survey found that the majority of people felt that they would be supported by their manager if they were to make a formal complaint. However, as you'll see on this slide, 13% felt that this wouldn't be the case. If you are a manager, This shows the need to ensure that you're creating a culture where escalation and challenge is encouraged. Supervision can act as a formal platform that gives you the opportunity to ask staff members if they have any concerns, if there's anything they need escalating. Unfortunately, within the audit, we did find some evidence of adultification bias. There were some situations involving Black children where it appears the police acted in a disproportionate manner. For example, detaining a 12-year-old overnight and detaining a child overnight despite the fact he was actually the victim. Upon release, it was reported that the police officers told this child that they'd handled the situation in a really mature manner. And it's important to note here that Janine Davies, who's a UK specialist in adultification, says that adultification bias can also be identified by the language used to describe children, such as using words such as streetwise, resilient, and mature. There was also a case where a 13-year-old boy was being questioned about an indecent image that had been found on his phone 2 years prior, so when he was just 11. The police were unable to find any evidence throughout this 2 years. However, they were still trying to pursue the alleged crime 2 years later. They finally dropped the case, but not without saying they still thought he'd done it anyway. The survey response suggests that the majority of people stated they knew what adultification meant, however 16% didn't, and actually the real number is likely to be higher of people who aren't sure of the meaning. There is clearly a need for more training on adultification to allow people to understand what it is and how to recognise it, and this forms one of our recommendations that we will come on to. The audit found really good use of appropriate adults, and many people in our community have carried out this role, including foster parents, residential staff, and also supervising social workers. As you can see from the survey findings, 60% of respondents said they had acted as an appropriate adult. This confirms the need for high quality training in this area. Throughout the audits, the thoughts and feelings of children who had had involvement with the police were not clearly recorded, and this is a clear area for development across the community. And good practice would involve speaking to these children routinely following their involvement to make sure that they're okay. And this is something we encourage you to do and record moving forwards. So as a result of the audit, we are recommending an increased training offer on subjects such as adultification, appropriate adults, challenging police, and the criminalisation of young people. And these training courses will all become available through the new L&D strategy. Secondly, we're recommending that the findings from the audit to be disseminated across the community. So we will be publishing the full report, a 7-minute learning briefing, an infographic, and of course this webinar are all available. We're asking that social workers and managers review situations where there has been police involvement. We are asking you to consider routinely speaking to children following any police involvement. We're reminding you about the escalation procedure and the availability to use this where required. To implement these findings into your own practice, so consider including them in service development plans, evidence records, anything like that really. This is really good evidence to Ofsted of how we are taking learning and embedding it into practice. And finally, there are two really useful documents we came across that we really suggest you read. The first is the National Protocol on Reducing Unnecessary Criminalisation of Looked After Children and Care Leavers. And the second is quite a recent piece of research about ending the overnight detention of children in police custody. And that's only a really short document that we recommend you read. And finally, we just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to anyone who took part in the survey. Thank you to anyone listening to this webinar. For any questions or comments, feel free to write them in the comment section or email me directly, Elizabeth O'Mara at polariscommunity.co.uk. We hope you found this useful and thank you very much.